If last week was a low narrative episode with high production values, then this week flips things around with a return to the main plot point, albeit with a modest but competent production. It is maybe one of the best examples that a strong storyboard and great animation director can elevate a low priority episode that could have been totally nothing into something mostly worth talking about. And low priority this absolutely was. It's all out war next week, and in fact that episode was in production months before this one. But in spite of a tiny staff list with almost no significant animation highlights to speak of, this episode looked great, and that's thanks to the return of Gaku Yano and Takumi Yamamoto. These two last paired up for Glorio vs Goku, resulting in one of the best storyboards of the show with so much fantastic artwork throughout. Yano's understanding of perspective is just completely unrivaled, and I'm glad that returns in full force once again. One of his defining traits is the way he cants the camera angle, making what would otherwise be a flat shot into something of real interest. This was all over his previous episode, and I made a point to have perspective lines overlaid on top to showcase this because it just seems so clear to me that this was an important part of his vision. I fortunately got to see his storyboard for this episode, and it actually confirmed my suspicions. All throughout, he draws those perspective lines in and conjures all these complex scenes around them. It results in shots that feel really geometric in the best kind of way. This is most prevalent with the framing inside the ship, where its tight spaces allow for wide angles that work really nicely with the hard edges of the chairs or ship walls. Likewise, the same approach can be found in the shop, where the tiles and shelves are basically as geometric as it gets. I also really like the big wide angle shot of Pella, where curves start being thrown into the mix, because I think more than anything, it's actually that curvature that very much defines this episode. With the scale of the opening of the gates being a focal point, Yano puts some real emphasis on these big sweeping curves in the environment. There are no flat horizons here. This stuff is huge and exaggerated and all the more impactful for it. But it's not just the environments, it's also there in establishing shots for dialogue scenes and even within the dialogue itself. We did see this approach a little bit in Yano's previous episode, but it definitely feels more at the forefront of this episode than before. It's actually the direction, however, that caught my eye more than the board, surprisingly. One of the big highlights is of course the introduction of the military police's special force, which is drenched in these wonderful colors and contrasting grim lights, while the posing and general attitude is of course pulling straight from the Ginyu force. It's impossible not to see the influence One Piece has had on Yano here, particularly Megumi Ishitani's episodes. She's done many a scene with big, bold neon lights like this, and the general musical influences to this scene just seem right at home with that. Even the text overlays and approach to the composite feel extremely evocative of the type of work found over on that show. I mean, the cutaway to showcase where people are within the world on an illustrated map is extremely One Piece and rare for Dragon Ball, but then so is the scenario we're about to enter, so that seems fitting. Other scenes of note are of course the parts where Neba actually opens the gateway and drenches the scenes in greens and purples. It's great to see the underlighting on Goku as he falls, or the way the gate reflects in Pansy's eye. It feels huge and unnerving, and I think that nicely sets up the back half of this episode as they finally break out into the final demon world. I think jumping straight from bright greens to bright reds with any immediacy would have felt kind of jarring and lackluster, so I actually really like the choice to coat the tunnel in a dim blue for a fairly extended period of time, and when they finally drop in, that red then feels overwhelming and punchy and exciting. I really think Yano did a great job of ramping up the tension at the end there in what is a pretty short amount of time. And not only that, it's a build-up that's intercut with a comedy cutaway to Do and Ku. To land that and restore tension immediately is pretty damn impressive, and he did this through clever pacing. Following that cutaway comes a quiet roar, an uncertainty from one side of the hole, and with a short ominous line from Irinsu, we jump back to the main crew. Now that's not something any viewer should actively be thinking about, but it's something I noticed when I was trying to work out why this kind of cutaway worked here, while in other episodes it kind of hurt the tension of the A-plot. I think the answer is that Yano just really gets how best to utilize the tools at his disposal, because it's kind of similar in the gate opening scene itself. A repetitive chant in a weaker director's hands could have fallen flat or felt silly, but the way this is boarded really brings about a gradual rise in tension, from the slow build of the orb in Neba's hands to the reaction shots. It's nailing it visually, but the music he's picked out is perfect too. It's likewise a gradual build, followed by a big crescendo of impact. Of course, to actually nail Yano's intentions, you need capable animation staff, and that's where Takumi Yamamoto, the animation director for this episode, comes in. I've of course spoken about him many times when the show first started, given he just kept popping up up time and time again with the most awesome work. But ever since episode 6, he's only shown up again to do assistant supervision on episodes 10 and 11. But looking at this episode, I think that makes a hell of a lot of sense. Across the board, this episode is basically top to bottom his style, and that actually surprised me. While Nakatsu redrew a lot of his previous episode, a few remaining shots were recognizably different, and yet here, despite being still kinda distinct, he really does look extremely close to Nakatsu himself. I think it's right to feel a little strange about putting an animator of his caliber on an episode of low importance like this, but I also think if you look at the complexity of Yano's storyboard, it suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. We of course saw in episode 12 what it's like when a good board isn't quite executed to its full potential, so I find it difficult to be too miffed by his allocation here. And I think with there being very little in the way of real animation, this may well result in him appearing in key episodes going forwards towards the finale. That's not to say that aspects like the military forces intro aren't well done, or that there aren't minor bits of nice stuff found throughout, but this is the first episode in a long while that there hasn't been any kind of significant action set piece. In fact, this might be the first since episode 2. Even the heavily flawed episode 7 still snuck one in there. The event in LA that was meant to showcase episode 15 early has understandably been cancelled due to all of the fires going on over there, but the notion that this was of screenable importance still rings true. Again, as I said at the start of this video, episode 15 was put into production much before this episode, so I have pretty high hopes. It seems, just based on the preview art, that it might be supervised by Kozue Ikamatsu, who led Daima's 8th episode and who hasn't actually solo-led an episode since then, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes and what guests appear. But other than that, that's actually kinda it for this week. This was probably the most low-key episode of Daima on the animation front, even if, as a collective package, its overall visual quality was great. With 6 episodes left, we're right into the climax now, so let's see what this team pulls off. Let me know what your hopes are for this climax. Who are you looking to see? What kind of fights are you after? Let me know. Otherwise, be sure to rate the video, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you next time.